You have never once, in your entire life, checked your most important bank account. Not the one with the routing number, the other one. The one that refills itself every midnight with exactly 86,400 units. No more, no less, and empties completely by the time you close your eyes. Whether you spent it or not. Here's the part that should bother you. You'd never let a stranger walk into your checking account and quietly drain it. You'd call the bank. You'd dispute the charge. You'd lose sleep over $40. But somewhere between waking up and scrolling through 3 apps you don't remember opening, 90 minutes vanished, and you didn't even flinch. I used to think being busy was the same thing as being rich in this currency. It isn't. I once tracked an entire Tuesday, every app open, every meeting attended, every email answered, convinced I'd find a productive man. I found a man who'd spent 11 hours in motion and built nothing. That was the day I understood the account doesn't care how busy you looked spending it. This isn't a book about hustle. You don't need more hours. Nobody gets more. You need to stop being the kind of person who doesn't notice the withdrawal. The geniuses, the ones who seem to have cracked some code the rest of us missed, didn't get a bigger account. They just started checking the balance. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The richest broke people alive. There's a particular kind of person who walks around feeling wealthy in time. You've met them. They say things like, "I've got plenty of time," the way other people say, "I've got plenty of money," right before a repo man shows up. It's not confidence. It's denial wearing a confident outfit. Here's what makes time different from every other resource you'll ever manage. Lose your savings, you rebuild. Lose your job, another one's hiring. Lose your phone, there's a newer model by Tuesday. But the 90 minutes you just spent in a meeting that should have been a 2-line email, that's not coming back. Nobody's issuing a refund. There's no customer service line for Tuesday afternoon. Most people don't think of time as currency because currency implies scarcity, and scarcity implies consequence, and consequence implies you should probably be paying attention. So instead, we talk about time the way toddlers talk about candy, as if it's infinite, as if the jar refills itself, as if later is a real place you can travel to. It isn't. Later is just today, wearing a disguise, waiting to become a today you also waste. I once watched a friend turn down a flight to see his father, who was sick, not gravely, just sick enough that everyone quietly knew the visits mattered more than they used to, because work was too much right now. 3 months later, work was still too much. It's always too much. That's not a scheduling problem. That's a man who thinks he has more 86,400 second days coming than he actually does. The people who use time well aren't smarter. They've just stopped lying to themselves about what an hour is worth. They ask one brutal, unglamorous question before committing to anything. What does this hour return? Not in money, though sometimes that too, but in skill, in connection, in something that's still standing 6 months from now. If the hour builds something, it's an investment. If it just numbs something, it's an expense. And expenses compound the same way investments do, just in the opposite direction. This is where most self-help nonsense goes wrong. It tells you to manage your time, like that's a scheduling app problem. It's not. It's an honesty problem. You don't actually need a better calendar. You need to stop calling 4 hours of mindless scrolling relaxing, when what you mean is, I didn't want to feel the thing I was avoiding, so I numbed it instead. There's nothing wrong with rest, by the way. Real rest. The kind that actually recharges something. The problem is, we've started using the word rest as a costume for avoidance. A walk without your phone is rest. 3 hours of short-form video at 11 p.m., scrolling past content you won't remember by morning, isn't rest. It's a withdrawal you're making while telling yourself it's a deposit. Here's the part that should actually change something for you. Every choice you make with an hour is a vote. Not a metaphorical one, an actual accumulating vote for the person you're quietly becoming. Spend the hour learning something, and 6 months from now, there's a slightly sharper, slightly more capable version of you standing in the mirror. Spend it numbing out, and there's a version of you that's slightly more practiced at avoidance. Neither happens overnight. Both happen, eventually, whether you notice or not. The billionaire and the broke college kid get the same 86,400 seconds. That's the part everyone quotes and nobody actually absorbs, because if it were true, really viscerally true, you'd treat your Tuesday afternoon like it was made of something finite, because it is. It's the only thing in your life that's guaranteed to run out, and the only thing you treat as though it won't. So here's the uncomfortable starting point. You're not behind because you lack time. Nobody lacks time. That's the one resource distributed with total, almost insulting fairness. You're behind because until you stop and actually look, you've had no idea where any of it went. Chapter 2. The question nobody asks before spending. Picture a man standing in front of an ATM about to withdraw $400, and instead of checking his balance, he just pulls the cash and walks away. No glance at the screen, no second thought. You'd assume he was either extremely wealthy or extremely careless. Now picture that same man opening Netflix at 9 p.m. with the exact same posture, the exact same blank certainty that there's plenty more where that came from. Nobody calls that careless. We call it Tuesday. The question that separates people who use time well from people who merely survive it isn't complicated. It's not a productivity hack, not a 5-step morning system, not something you need an app to track for you. It's one sentence asked before you spend an hour, not after. While there's still something to decide. What return am I getting for this? That's the entire filter. And the reason almost nobody uses it isn't that it's hard to ask. It's 3 words long. The reason is that asking it requires you to actually want an answer, which means occasionally hearing none, which means occasionally admitting, in real time, that you're about to waste something you will never get back. Most people would rather not know. Not knowing is comfortable. Not knowing lets you keep scrolling without the small, irritating voice that says, you could be doing something else with this. I'll admit something here. For years, I treated this question as an accusation rather than a tool. Every time it surfaced, some defensive part of my brain heard, "You're lazy, you're wasting your life." And I'd flinch away from the question entirely rather than sit with an honest answer. That's backwards, and it took embarrassingly long to notice. The question isn't a verdict. It's a checkpoint. You're allowed to spend an hour on something with 0 productive return. You're just supposed to know that's what you're doing, instead of accidentally discovering it 3 hours later with a headache, a stiff neck, and nothing to show for the time except a faint, unplaceable guilt. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the answer to what's the return isn't fixed. It moves. The exact same hour of Netflix can be a brilliant investment or a quiet theft, and the difference has almost nothing to do with the show itself. It depends entirely on what state you're in when you reach for it. If you've had a brutal day, the kind where your nervous system is fried, your patience is gone, and your decision-making has the structural integrity of wet cardboard, an hour of mindless, low-stakes entertainment is a legitimate deposit into your recovery. You're not wasting that hour. You're spending it on the only thing that hour can actually buy you: a functioning brain tomorrow morning, which is worth more than whatever productive task you'd have half-assed in its place. But if that same show becomes the default, if it's not a choice anymore, just a reflex your thumb performs the second you sit down, regardless of how the day went. If you genuinely couldn't tell me why you're watching it beyond, "I don't know, it's just what I do at night," that's not rest anymore. That's autopilot, and autopilot never asks for return on investment. It just spends indiscriminately the same way a leaking pipe doesn't ask whether the house needs more water. This is the part people consistently get wrong about high performers. They assume these people never relax, never watch anything, never scroll, exist in some grim monastic state of permanent output. That's not it at all. And frankly, that version of discipline tends to collapse within a month anyway. The difference isn't abstinence, it's intention. A person who consciously decides, "I need an hour of nothing right now," and gets exactly that, fully present, no guilt attached, has made a smart trade. Rest purchased on purpose. A person who falls into the same hour without deciding anything has just been quietly robbed and doesn't know it yet. Won't know it until the pattern's repeated itself for the third or fourth night running, and they wonder, vaguely, where the week went. There's a deeper version of this question, and it's the one that actually reshapes how a life looks 5 years out. If I invest this hour today, what does my life look like in 6 months? Most people can't answer that, not because they're incapable of thinking ahead, but because they've never connected today's small, disposable feeling hour to that future at all. The hour feels isolated, inconsequential, like it exists in its own sealed container with no relationship to anything that comes after it. It isn't isolated, it's a brick. You're either laying one or you're not, and either way the wall gets built. It's just a question of what the thing ends up made of, and whether you'd actually want to live inside it. I've noticed something else too, something almost nobody says out loud. People who claim, "I don't have time," almost never mean it literally. What they actually mean, if you push past the phrase, is, "I haven't decided clearly enough what I want for the time to organize itself around it." Clarity is the real scarce resource here, not time. The moment you know, specifically, what an hour is supposed to be doing for you, hours start appearing from places you swore were already full. Not because the day got longer, it didn't, it never will, but because you stopped spending 3 of those hours on things you never actually wanted in the first place. You just hadn't noticed you were spending them at all. So before your next free hour arrives, and it will, probably sooner than you think, probably tonight, try asking the question honestly, just once. Not as a judge handing down a verdict, as an accountant doing a quiet reconciliation. What's the return here? Sometimes the honest answer will be rest, and that's genuinely enough. Often it will surprise you in the other direction. But the asking itself, that 1-second pause before the spend, is the entire difference between a life that happens to you in the background and one you're quietly, deliberately building 1 hour at a time. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3, The 2-Hour Economy. Somewhere there's a man who wakes up at 5 a.m., sits down with a notebook, writes 3 pages of strategic clarity, and feels like a genius. Then at 9 p.m., after dinner, after the day's done its damage, He sits down at that same notebook to plan tomorrow and produces something that reads like it was written by his own evil twin. Same brain, same desk, same pen, completely different output. Most people would call this inconsistency. It isn't. It's chemistry. Here's the thing. Almost nobody tells you about your own brain. It is not the same instrument at 9 a.m. that it is at 9 p.m. It runs on cycles, alertness rising and falling across the day like tides. Not because of willpower or discipline, but because of biology that doesn't care what your calendar says. Somewhere in that daily cycle, usually for a window of 2 to 3 hours, your brain hits its actual peak. Sharpest thinking, cleanest decisions, fastest pattern recognition. The rest of the day, by comparison, is somewhat functional background noise. This window has a name worth knowing. Prime time. Not the TV kind, the biological kind. And here's the part that should genuinely bother you. Most people have absolutely no idea when theirs is. And worse, they routinely spend it on things that don't deserve it. Email, meetings that could have been a sentence, scrolling through a feed that forgets you the second you close the app. All while their brain is operating at the one capacity level it'll have all day, burning that capacity on tasks any tired, half-functional version of themselves could have handled just as well. I learned this the expensive way. For 2 years, I did my best creative thinking. Writing, strategy, the actual hard cognitive lifting. In the evening, after dinner, because that's when I felt like working. What I actually felt was guilt for not having worked earlier, dressed up as motivation. The output from those evening sessions was fine, serviceable, forgettable. It wasn't until I properly tracked it hour by hour for 2 weeks, that I noticed something humiliating. My sharpest, cleanest, most original thinking happened in a 2-hour window around 9 a.m. that I had been spending entirely on email. This is the part that separates people who seem to effortlessly outperform everyone else from people who work twice as hard for half the result. It's not that the high performers found more hours. Everyone gets the same 24. It's that they figured out which 2 or 3 of those hours were worth 10 times the others, and they built a wall around that window like it was a vault. No calls during prime time, no messages, just a quick meeting. Not because those things don't matter, they do eventually, somewhere in the day, but because none of them require your sharpest thinking, and using your sharpest thinking on a task that any groggy version of you could have handled is the cognitive equivalent of using a surgeon to do data entry. Technically possible. Insulting to the surgeon. The mistake almost everyone makes here is trying to force their prime time to match someone else's. You read that successful people wake up at 5 a.m., so you set an alarm for 5 a.m., and you sit there at your desk producing absolutely nothing of value because your actual peak window doesn't open until 10. This isn't a discipline failure, it's a category error. Some brains are morning larks, genuinely sharper before the world wakes up. Others are night owls, sluggish at dawn, and oddly brilliant by 9 p.m. Forcing either type to perform on the other's schedule doesn't build character. It just produces tired, frustrated people who've started calling themselves lazy for a problem that was never about effort. So how do you actually find yours? Not with a productivity app. With observation, the same way you'd notice which restaurant always upsets your stomach. For about a week, just watch. When does reading feel effortless instead of like wading through mud? When does a hard decision suddenly feel obvious instead of paralyzing? When do distractions lose their pull entirely? Not because you're resisting them, but because you're simply not interested. That window, usually shorter than people expect, often just 2 or 3 hours, is your prime time. It rarely announces itself with fanfare. It just quietly works better than everything around it. Once you find it, the instruction is almost insultingly simple. Protect it like it's the only thing standing between you and the life you actually want, because in a very real sense, it is. Reserve it exclusively for the work that requires your full cognitive weight. The writing, the building, the deciding, the learning that actually compounds. Shove the shallow stuff, emails, scheduling, the digital busy work that fills a day without filling a life, into whatever hours are left, the ones where your brain's already running at half capacity anyway and won't notice the difference. There's a gym analogy that lands better than most. You lift the heaviest weights first, while you're fresh, not after you're already exhausted from the warm-up set. Nobody walks into a gym, does an hour of stretching, and then attempts a personal record on the deadlift. Yet that's precisely the order most people run their days, burning the fresh hours on low-stakes noise, then dragging their depleted, frazzled brain to the one task that actually mattered, wondering why it felt impossibly hard. Here's the quietly brutal math behind all of this. You don't need to optimize 24 hours. You need to optimize 2 or 3. The other 21 can be merely average, scattered, reactive, half-focused, and your life still moves forward because the 2 or 3 hours you protected were doing the real work the entire time. That's not a productivity hack. That's just paying attention to which currency you're actually rich in and refusing to spend it on things that were never worth the price. Chapter 4. The expiration date on a good idea. There's a particular kind of grief nobody talks about. The grief of an idea you used to be excited about. You know the one. It hit you on a Tuesday, fully formed, electric, the kind of idea that makes your heart actually speed up a little. You could see it. You could feel what your life would look like if you actually did it. And then, somehow, by the following Tuesday, that same idea sits in your head like a piece of furniture nobody asked for. Present, vaguely embarrassing, untouched. Here's the part nobody warns you about. Inspiration isn't a renewable resource. It has a shelf life, and that shelf life is shorter than you think. Somewhere in the first 24 hours after a strong idea hits, your emotional state and your logical state are temporarily out of sync. Belief is high. Doubt is quiet. The part of your brain that normally lists 11 reasons why this won't work hasn't woken up yet. That window is the only time the idea will ever feel this possible. After that, logic shows up to the party, uninvited, and starts narrating reasons to wait. I've lost track of how many ideas I've personally let expire this way. Not failed at, never even started. A business concept I was genuinely excited about for exactly one evening, gone by morning, replaced by the perfectly reasonable thought that I should research it more first. Research in this context is often just procrastination wearing a blazer. This is where the rule comes in, and it's almost insultingly simple, which is exactly why people resist it. If a strong idea hits you, you take some action. Any action, however small, within 24 hours. Not the whole project, not a business plan. Just one real, concrete step that proves to your own brain you were serious. Want to write a book? Write the outline, not the manuscript. Got a business idea? Buy the domain. Thinking about a YouTube channel? Create the channel. Empty, unfinished, doesn't matter. The size of the action isn't the point. The speed is. Here's why this works. And it's not mystical. It's mechanical. Your brain treats action as evidence. When an idea arrives and gets acted on, even in some small, scrappy, unfinished way, your brain logs it as this person follows through and This is the part that surprised me. Start sending more ideas, more frequently, because the previous one didn't get wasted. When an idea arrives and gets ignored, your brain logs the opposite. Not worth the effort. Stop sending these. People who say, "I'm just not a creative person," are very often people whose brains simply stopped bothering because every previous idea died of neglect. There's also a quieter benefit hiding in this rule, one that has nothing to do with the idea itself. Taking fast, imperfect action kills perfectionism before it gets a foothold. Perfectionism's entire argument is that you need clarity before you start. The 24-hour rule flips that completely. You get clarity from starting, not before it. The path doesn't reveal itself to people standing still, studying the map. It reveals itself to people already a few steps down the road, squinting at what's in front of them. I want to be honest about something here, because this chapter could easily turn into another piece of hollow hustle content, and that's not what this is. The 24-hour rule isn't about chasing every idea that flickers through your head. Most ideas, frankly, deserve to die quietly, and that's fine. Not every spark needs a fire built around it. The rule applies specifically to the ones with weight. The ones that make your chest tighten a little. The ones you'll still be thinking about at 2 a.m., turning them over, half annoyed they won't leave you alone. Those are the ones that have an expiration date worth racing. And there's a deeper mechanism at work underneath all of this, one that's less about productivity and more about identity. Fear lives almost entirely in the future, in the imagined failure, the imagined embarrassment, the imagined version of you that tried and looked foolish. Action lives only in the present. The moment you take that first concrete step, even something as small as buying a domain or opening a blank document, fear's volume drops. Not because you've suddenly become braver, but because there's simply less future left for it to live in. You haven't gained confidence yet. Confidence comes later, built from evidence. What you've gained is courage, which is the much rarer thing. The willingness to move before you feel ready. That distinction matters more than people give it credit for. Confident people wait until they feel sure, then act. Courageous people act while still unsure, and the confidence shows up afterward, built from the proof of having survived the attempt. Every person you've ever admired for just going for it wasn't operating from some special reserve of fearlessness. They were just willing to take the small action inside the 24-hour window before doubt had time to assemble its case. So here's what I'd ask of you. Simply, the next time a real idea lands, not the throwaway ones, the ones with actual weight behind them. Don't promise yourself you'll finish it. That promise is too big, and big promises are exactly what perfectionism uses to stall you. Promise something smaller and far more honest. I won't let this die for more than 24 hours. Not finished, just started. Because the beginning, as it turns out, is the only part of any idea that's actually difficult, and the only part with an expiration date. Chapter 5. The fortune hiding in lines and waiting rooms. There's a specific kind of boredom that arrives in waiting rooms, checkout lines, and red lights. Small, forgettable, 5 minutes at a time boredom. And almost everyone responds to it the exact same way, with the exact same motion. Phone out, thumb moving, brain gone. Nobody plans this. It's reflex by now, the way you'd flinch from something hot. And because it feels so small each time, nobody bothers to add it up. Let's add it up. 30 minutes a day, conservatively, across commutes, lines, waiting rooms, that dead stretch before a meeting starts. 30 minutes, multiplied across a year, lands you somewhere around 180 hours. That's not a rounding error. That's enough time to genuinely learn the basics of a language, get through 20 or more books, or build real competence in a skill you've been telling yourself for years you just don't have time for. The time was never missing. It was being spent, just on something with no return at all. I want to be careful here, because this could easily curdle into another joyless productivity sermon. Optimize every second. Never rest. Treat your own boredom like a crime. That's not the point. And frankly, that version of advice tends to collapse within a month because nobody can sustain permanent vigilance. The actual idea is smaller and far more livable than that. It's not never waste a moment. It's stop reaching for the thing that costs you the most while giving you the least. Because here's what's quietly insulting about how most people spend these gaps. Scrolling doesn't even function as rest. It feels like rest, passive, low effort, thumb doing all the work. But the actual experience afterward tells a different story. You finish a 15-minute scroll session and you're not relaxed. You're slightly worse. Mind a bit foggier, mood a bit flatter, and you genuinely could not tell anyone what you just looked at. Compare that to 15 minutes spent reading 2 pages of a book, or listening to part of something that actually taught you a fact you didn't have before. Same 15 minutes. Wildly different residue. I started carrying a book again a few years back, mostly out of stubbornness more than any grand productivity plan. And the thing that surprised me wasn't how much I read. It was how much less I dreaded waiting. A delayed appointment used to feel like 15 minutes stolen from me. Once I had something worth reaching for instead of my phone, the same delay just became 15 minutes I happened to have. The wait didn't change. My relationship to it did. This is what I mean by zero wait time. Not some rigid system where every idle second must be monetized into output, but a simple shift in what you reach for when your hands and mind are otherwise unoccupied. It's not heavy. There's no exam at the end. You're not trying to finish a book in a checkout line. You're just removing the autopilot reach for content that leaves you worse off and quietly replacing it with something that leaves you, even marginally, better off. The beauty of this particular shift, and the reason it actually sticks where most habit advice doesn't, is that it requires zero new time. You're not waking up earlier. You're not cutting into sleep, work, or anything that already matters to you. You're just redirecting time that was already being spent, already gone either way, towards something with a return instead of something with none. That's the rarest kind of improvement, one that costs you nothing you'll miss. There's a compounding effect here too, beyond just the raw hours. Reading or learning in small, low-pressure doses, 5 pages here, 10 minutes of something educational there, tends to stick better than the marathon study sessions people associate with real learning, precisely because there's no pressure attached. No exam, no deadline, no performance anxiety. Just a small, repeated exposure to something worth knowing, the kind of light, consistent intake that, like food, your mind seems to actually prefer over occasional binges. A year of this, quietly stacked, produces something strange and a little uncomfortable to witness from the outside. 2 people start the year in roughly the same place. Neither adds a single extra hour to their day. By December, one of them has noticeably more vocabulary, sharper conversation, faster pattern recognition on problems they've encountered before. Not from some heroic effort, but from 180 hours of waiting rooms spent differently than the other person's 180 hours. Nobody on the outside can point to the moment it happened. There wasn't one. It happened in the gaps, which is exactly why nobody noticed it happening at all. So here's the smallest possible starting point, if you want one. Next time you're waiting somewhere, actually waiting, the kind with nothing to do, Skip the reflex. Just once. Read a page. Listen to 2 minutes of something. Write down a single thought you've been meaning to capture. That's the whole ask. Not a revolution. Just one small redirection of time that was already leaving your hands either way, pointed somewhere it'll actually still be there for you months from now, when you go looking for it. Chapter 6. The 4 questions that end decision fatigue. By the time most people sit down to do their actual work, they've already made several hundred decisions and don't remember a single one of them. What to wear. What to eat. Which message gets answered first. Which call gets picked up. Which request gets a guilty yes instead of a clean no. None of these feel like decisions in the moment. They feel like reflexes, but each one quietly taxes the same finite resource. And by 2 p.m. that resource is running on fumes. This has a name, and it's not laziness. It's not lack of discipline. It's decision fatigue. A measurable decline in the quality of your choices as the day wears on, simply because the muscle making them has been working since you opened your eyes. People who seem disorganized or scattered by late afternoon often aren't lazy at all. They're just out of decision-making capacity. The same way a phone battery doesn't get worse at thinking by evening, it just runs out of charge. I used to think the fix for this was more discipline. Push harder, decide faster, grit through it. That's backwards, and it took me longer than I'd like to admit to see why. The actual fix isn't more willpower applied to each decision. It's fewer decisions in the first place, not fewer tasks. Fewer decisions about tasks. There's a difference, and it's the entire point of this chapter. The framework that fixed this for me is uncomfortably simple, almost suspiciously so. Every time something lands on your plate, a task, a request, a message, an obligation, you run it through 4 questions before doing anything with it at all. Delete, delegate, defer, do. Delete comes first, and it's the one people skip, because skipping it feels safer. Most of what arrives in a day isn't actually necessary. It just arrived with enough urgency-shaped packaging that it felt necessary. A meeting that's really just a status update. A request accepted out of mild guilt rather than genuine obligation. A notification dressed up as something requiring your attention when it's really just requesting it. The honest estimate is that somewhere between 60 and 70% of what lands on a typical day's plate doesn't need to be there at all. Deleting it isn't rude. It's removing static from a signal that was getting harder to hear. Delegate is next, and this one runs straight into ego, which is exactly why most people avoid it. The question isn't, can someone else do this exactly the way I would? It's, can someone else do this at roughly 80% of my quality? If the answer's yes, hand it over, because the math almost always favors you. An 80% version done by someone else, freeing up your time for the work only you can do, beats a 100% version done by you at the cost of everything else that hour could have produced. This isn't a confession of weakness. It's closer to the opposite. It's recognizing that your actual job isn't to do everything. It's to do the right things and protect the capacity to keep doing them. Defer handles everything that's genuinely important, but not actually urgent right now, which is most of what feels urgent in the moment and almost none of what's labeled that way. Notifications feel urgent. Planning feels boring. But notifications rarely change anything 6 months out, and planning almost always does. The fix here isn't ignoring the deferred task. It's giving it a real, specific time on the calendar, because an undated task just sits in your head, quietly draining attention, even while you're not actively thinking about it. Once it has a slot, your brain stops guarding it like an open tab, and you get that attention back immediately, before the task itself is even touched. Do is the last category, and by the time something reaches it, there's not much left to decide. It's the rare combination of genuinely important and genuinely urgent. Can't be deleted, can't be handed off, can't wait. These tasks deserve immediate, full attention, with none of the second guessing that drains people on the easier categories. The clarity of having already filtered everything else means the remaining tasks get your best thinking instead of leftover thinking. What surprised me most about this framework, once I actually started running things through it consistently, wasn't how much got eliminated, though plenty did. It was how much lighter the whole day felt afterward, even on days where the task list barely shrank. The exhaustion was never really about the number of things. It was about deciding, over and over, in real time, what each thing deserved. Once that's been decided in advance, by a framework instead of by your already depleted brain, at 3 p.m., the day stops chasing you. You start running it instead. There's a quieter benefit here too, one that doesn't show up until you've run this for a few weeks. The framework doesn't just save time on individual tasks. It changes your relationship to incoming requests generally. Things stop feeling like emergencies the moment they land, because you already know they're heading somewhere. Deleted, handed off, scheduled, or handled now. And that knowing alone removes most of the panic that used to accompany a full inbox. None of this requires becoming a colder, more clinical version of yourself. It just requires admitting that not every request deserves your full attention, not every yes is owed, and not every task that shows up uninvited has earned a place on your day. Run the 4 questions. And most of what used to feel like chaos turns out to have been, the whole time, just things waiting for someone to decide what they actually deserved. Chapter 7. The fuel problem, not the time problem. There's a version of this story you've probably lived yourself. 5 free hours, nothing scheduled, the entire afternoon wide open, and somehow, by the end of it, nothing actually happened. Not because you didn't try. You sat down. You opened the document. You stared at it. The hours were there, technically unspent in the sense that you didn't do anything with them, but they're gone now anyway, and you have nothing to show for the time except a faint, specific kind of guilt. This is the part almost everyone gets wrong about productivity, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to get it right myself. We talk about it like it's purely a time problem. Manage your hours better, fill your calendar smarter, optimize the schedule, when very often it's not a time problem at all. It's a fuel problem. 5 free hours with an exhausted brain produces roughly the output of 0 free hours with a sharp one. The math doesn't favor more time. It favors better fuel. I noticed this most clearly on the days that made no sense by any reasonable logic. 30 minutes of focused work outproducing what should have been an entire productive afternoon, simply because I'd happened to catch myself in the right state. And then the opposite, a full day, 8, 9 hours at the desk, producing almost nothing worth keeping, because I'd spent the whole stretch in what I've started calling zombie mode. Technically present, eyes open, brain somewhere else entirely. There's a biological reason for this that's worth understanding, because once you see it, you stop fighting it. The brain isn't built to sustain deep focus indefinitely. It runs in cycles, roughly 90 minutes of genuine capacity for hard, demanding work, followed by a natural drop where pushing harder just produces lower quality output dressed up as effort. This is the ultradian rhythm, and ignoring it doesn't make you tougher. It just means you spend the back half of every cycle producing work you'll have to redo later, while convincing yourself you were being disciplined the whole time. The fix here isn't complicated, but it does require letting go of a belief most of us absorbed somewhere along the way. That breaks are a reward you earn after working hard enough, rather than a requirement for the work to be good in the first place. 90 minutes of real focus, followed by 15 or 20 minutes of genuine recovery, beats 4 straight hours of grinding through diminishing returns every single time. The catch is that the recovery has to actually be recovery. Scrolling during the break doesn't recharge anything. If anything, it adds another layer of depletion on top of the one you were trying to recover from. A short walk does. Water does. Staring out a window, doing genuinely nothing, does. The brain needs the kind of rest that looks boring from the outside. Not the kind that looks like rest, but functions like more input. I want to push this a little further than the standard take breaks advice, because there's a deeper layer most people miss entirely. Energy isn't one single dial you can just top off with sleep. It runs on at least 4 separate tracks, and they don't substitute for each other. Physical energy, the body's basic capacity to function. Mental energy, clarity, the absence of clutter, the ability to actually think instead of just process. Emotional energy, which comes, more than people expect, from a sense of purpose rather than from rest itself. And something harder to name but unmistakable when it's missing. Call it alignment. The sense that what you're doing actually connects to something you care about. A person can sleep 8 perfect hours and still show up depleted, because the depletion was never physical to begin with. It was mental clutter, or emotional flatness, or doing work disconnected from anything that matters to them. This is why just get more sleep fixes almost nothing for some people. The leak was never in that pipe. Here's the practical shift this points toward. And it's less about adding new rituals than most people assume. It's about noticing which tasks fuel you and which ones quietly drain you, regardless of how productive either one looks from the outside. Some tasks energize you even though they're hard. They leave you sharper, more interested, slightly more alive than when you started. Others exhaust you even though they're easy, low effort, mindless, and somehow you finish them feeling worse than before you began. The first category deserves your high-energy windows. The second deserves to be batched, minimized, or, where possible, deleted entirely. Because no amount of scheduling optimization fixes a task that's quietly poisoning your energy every time you touch it. There's also something worth saying about the difference between productive discomfort and actual burnout. Because people frequently confuse the two and end up either avoiding necessary challenge or pushing straight through real depletion. Productive discomfort feels like effort. You're stretched, maybe a little uncomfortable, but there's an undercurrent of energy underneath it, the sense that this is building something. Burnout feels like numbness, flat, hollow. No undercurrent at all, just depletion wearing the costume of fatigue. The first one you push through. The second one you need to actually stop and address. Because pushing through numbness doesn't produce results. It just produces more numbness with extra steps. So here's the shift worth making, and it costs nothing to try. Instead of asking, before committing to something, do I have time for this? Start asking, do I have energy for this? Time without energy behind it is just empty hours stacked on a calendar, technically available but functionally useless. Energy aimed at the right things, even in smaller quantities, is how everything that's ever actually mattered got built. Chapter 8. The Cost of Switching Lanes. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how hard you worked. and everything to do with how many times you stopped working on one thing to start working on another. You can feel it by 6 p.m. on certain days, bone tired, despite having technically accomplished very little. The kind of tired that doesn't match the output. That mismatch isn't a mystery. It's the bill for switching lanes all day. Here's what's actually happening, mechanically. Every time you stop writing a report to check a message, then return to the report, then take a call, then return to the report again. Your brain doesn't switch instantly the way a light switch does. It has to reload context every single time. What was I doing? Where was I? What's the goal here? And that reload isn't free. Research puts the cost of fully regaining deep focus after an interruption somewhere between 15 and 25 minutes. If you're switching every 10 minutes, which is closer to normal than people want to admit, you're not actually reaching deep focus at any point in the day. You're operating permanently in the shallow end, while feeling busy enough to assume you're somewhere deeper. I tested this on myself once, mostly out of stubbornness, by tracking how many times I switched tasks during what I'd have called a focused writing day. The number embarrassed me. Dozens. Each switch felt small and harmless in isolation. Just a quick glance at a message, just a 30-second reply. But stacked together, the day produced roughly 40 minutes of actual deep output spread across 9 hours of being technically at my desk. The work wasn't hard. The constant reloading was the work. The fix here is one of the least glamorous productivity ideas around, which is probably why it's also one of the most underused. Batching. Instead of letting similar tasks scatter randomly across your day, you group them and handle them in one dedicated block. Email gets 2 windows, not 47 check-ins. Calls get a specific window, not whenever someone happens to ping you. Content, admin work, planning, each gets its own protected slot, rather than bleeding into every other slot around it. What surprised me most about batching wasn't the time saved, although there's real time saved. It was the decision fatigue it quietly eliminated. Once email has a fixed window, you stop deciding dozens of times a day whether now is a good moment to check it. That decision's already been made in advance by the structure itself. The same goes for calls, for messages, for any recurring category of shallow work that used to interrupt the deeper stuff on no particular schedule at all. There's a version of resistance to this worth addressing directly, because I had it myself for a while. Batching feels, on the surface, like it might make you less responsive, possibly even a little rude. What if someone needs you urgently and you're not checking messages every 5 minutes? In practice, the opposite tends to happen. People adjust to whatever pattern you establish almost immediately. Tell someone you check messages twice a day and respond within 24 hours unless it's genuinely urgent, and most people simply absorb that as the new normal. The same way they've absorbed everyone else's response patterns without thinking twice. The handful of people who push back against that boundary are generally the same people who weren't respecting your time before you set it. The deeper benefit, though, the one that doesn't show up until you've protected a few batched blocks for several weeks running, is what happens to the quality of thinking inside them. When a block of time is genuinely uninterrupted, not just nominally free, but actually protected from the constant micro-switches, the mind goes somewhere it can't reach in fragmented conditions. It starts connecting things, wandering productively, surfacing the kind of idea that doesn't announce itself in advance, the kind people describe as coming out of nowhere, except it never actually comes from nowhere. It comes from sustained, undisturbed attention, which is precisely the thing constant switching makes structurally impossible. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it cuts against a popular myth. People tend to assume that batching, with its rigid blocks and fixed windows, must come at the cost of creativity. That structure and spontaneity are opposites. The evidence runs the other way. Creativity doesn't usually arrive in chaos. It arrives in protected space, the kind only available once you've stopped letting every notification reroute your attention on demand. Structure isn't the enemy of freedom here. It's what makes the freedom possible in the first place. Because freedom without structure just defaults to whatever's loudest in the moment, which is rarely the thing that actually matters. So the practical version of this is smaller than it sounds. You don't need to redesign your entire week from scratch. Pick one category first: email, calls, whatever currently interrupts you most often throughout the day, and give it a fixed window instead of letting it scatter freely. Notice what happens to the rest of the day once that one category stops bleeding into everything else. It's rarely dramatic at first. It's just quieter, less fragmented, and somehow, by the end of it, you've produced more while switching less, which is the entire point, even if it doesn't feel like a victory until you compare it to how exhausted you usually are by 6 p.m. Chapter 9, The Busyness Costume. There's a particular look people get when you ask how their week was. Eyes a little wide, a small, exhausted laugh. Honestly, it's been insane, back to back the whole time. It's said with something close to pride. Somewhere along the way, exhaustion became evidence of worth, and a packed calendar became a kind of social currency, proof that you matter enough to be needed constantly. Nobody examines this claim too closely, because examining it would mean admitting that most of what filled the calendar didn't actually need to be there. Here's the uncomfortable distinction underneath all of it. Activity is motion. Achievement is progress. They get treated as the same thing constantly, but they're not even close. You can sit through 12 meetings in a day and move nothing forward. You can answer 200 messages and finish exactly nothing. You can work 14 hours and produce less of actual value than someone who worked 2 hours with their full attention on the one thing that mattered. The hours don't measure anything by themselves. They're just a container. What's inside the container is the only part that counts. I spent a stretch of years, longer than I'd like to admit, treating a full calendar as proof I was doing well. If someone asked what I'd been up to, swamped felt like a satisfying answer, almost a flex. It took an uncomfortably long time to notice that being swamped and being effective had stopped having any relationship to each other. I was busy in the way a hamster on a wheel is busy. Motion, certainly. Distance traveled, not so much. The shift that actually changes this isn't working harder. It's getting ruthless about a single question before agreeing to anything. Will this create disproportionate value? Not, is this fine? Not, could this be useful? But specifically, will this matter more than the hour it costs? Most things, examine this honestly, don't clear that bar. The meeting that could have been 3 sentences in a message. The call that exists mostly out of habit rather than necessity. The report nobody will actually read past the first paragraph. These things survive not because they're valuable, but because nobody bothered to ask the question that would have killed them. This is where opportunity cost becomes impossible to ignore once you actually start tracking it. Every hour given to something low value is an hour explicitly not given to something that could have mattered. That's not abstract. It's a direct trade, happening constantly, mostly invisibly, because the cost of a wasted hour doesn't announce itself the way a wasted dollar does. There's no receipt. Just a slightly emptier version of what the day could have been. The hardest part of this entire shift, harder than any scheduling trick, is accepting that you genuinely cannot do everything. and that trying to anyway doesn't make you thorough. It guarantees mediocrity spread across more things instead of excellence concentrated in fewer. I used to think saying yes to more was a form of generosity or ambition or both. It's neither. It's just dilution. 3 things done with real focus will outperform 30 things done at half attention every single time, and the math isn't close. This requires saying no to things that aren't even bad ideas, which is the part people resist most. It's relatively easy to decline something obviously low value. It's much harder to decline something genuinely good, an opportunity that would be fine, would probably even go well, but doesn't quite clear the bar of being worth the hours it would cost. The discipline isn't in rejecting bad options. Anyone can do that. It's in rejecting good ones. Repeatedly, because good is precisely what crowds out great. A calendar full of decent commitments leaves zero room for the rare excellent one, should it actually show up. What's worth noticing here, and what tends to surprise people once they start operating this way, is that the people who seem to accomplish the most rarely look the busiest from the outside. They're not running between 12 things. They're doing 2 or 3 things with a kind of focus that looks, from a distance, almost suspiciously calm. That calm isn't a personality trait. It's the visible result of having already said no to the 11 other things that would have made the calendar look more impressive, while making the output considerably worse. There's a quiet courage required here that doesn't get talked about much. Declining things, especially the good but not essential ones, often looks like laziness from the outside, at least initially. People notice the empty space on your calendar before they notice what filled the gap. It's only later, once the output starts speaking for itself, that the empty space gets reframed as discipline rather than absence. Until then, you're operating on faith that the math actually works. That fewer, better hours beat more, scattered ones. And trusting that faith, before the results have arrived to confirm it, is most of what this chapter is actually asking of you. So the practical shift is smaller than it sounds, and it starts with noticing, just for a week, how many things on your calendar would survive the honest question. Will this create disproportionate value, or did it just slip in because nobody asked? Most things won't survive that question. That's not a problem. That's the entire point. The goal was never to fill every hour. It's to make the hours that remain count for something, and a calendar that's finally honest about that tends to look a lot emptier and produce a lot more than the one it replaced. Chapter 10. The Art of Doing Less on Purpose. There's a kind of laziness worth defending, which sounds like a contradiction until you actually sit with it. Not the couch and scroll kind, the deliberate kind, the discipline of refusing to do things that don't need doing, even when everyone around you is doing them anyway, out of pure habit. This isn't an excuse to coast. It's arguably harder than working hard, because it requires constantly questioning things most people never think to question at all. Most days run on inertia rather than intention. Meetings happen because they happened last week. Tasks survive on a list because nobody ever asked whether they belonged there in the first place. Habits persist not because they're useful, but because removing them would require a decision, and decisions are expensive. So the path of least resistance is just letting everything stay. The people who use time genuinely well aren't asking what more they can add. They're constantly asking what they can stop doing, and the answer is almost always more than they expected. I remember the first time I actually audited a week's worth of necessary tasks with this lens, rather than just assuming they were necessary because they were on the list. Roughly a third of them, once examined honestly, existed for no better reason than habit. A recurring check-in that had outlived its purpose months earlier. A A report I compiled diligently that when I finally asked, nobody downstream had been reading for at least 2 quarters. None of this was laziness on my part originally. It was just accumulated obligation, the kind that builds up quietly when nobody ever goes back and asks whether the thing still earns its place. There's a useful flip here, a single question that reframes an entire project. Most people approach a piece of work asking what they need to do to make it succeed. That's a reasonable question, but it's incomplete because it only ever adds. The sharper version asks the opposite. What can I not do and still have this succeed? This single reversal tends to expose how much of any project is padding rather than substance. The presentation doesn't need 40 slides if the actual argument lives in 10 of them. The report doesn't need 30 pages if the insight that matters could fit in 3, written with enough clarity that nobody needs the other 27 to understand it. This extends past tasks and into something quieter. The mental clutter most people carry around without noticing its weight. Half-finished thoughts, vague obligations that never got scheduled, just left floating. I should probably call that person back. I need to figure out that thing eventually. Maybe I'll start that project someday. None of these feel urgent individually, which is exactly why they accumulate, sometimes into dozens of open loops running quietly in the background of an already busy mind, draining a little attention each one all day without ever resolving into anything. The fix here isn't willpower. It's externalizing. Either something matters enough to capture properly and schedule, or it doesn't matter enough to keep occupying space in your head. There's no honest third category, no permanent maybe someday folder where things get to live forever without ever being decided on. A mind holding 50 unresolved loops isn't thinking clearly about any of them. It's just running 50 pieces of quiet background software, none of them doing anything useful, all of them costing something. Communication deserves its own version of this same discipline, and it's one of the harder ones to practice without guilt. Not every message demands an instant reply. Not every conversation requires participation just because technology makes responding effortlessly possible. There's a quiet truth worth sitting with here. Every immediate response trains the people around you to expect another one. Reply within 90 seconds consistently, and 90 seconds becomes the expectation, regardless of whether the message actually warranted that urgency. Set a clearer boundary instead, check messages at specific times, respond meaningfully within a day unless something's genuinely urgent. And most people adjust without complaint, because most people weren't actually demanding instant replies. They were just responding to whatever pace you'd already established. Learning gets the same treatment, and this one surprised me most. The instinct is to consume more books, more courses, more information, as if comprehensiveness were the goal. But depth on a small number of core principles, genuinely applied, consistently beats shallow exposure to 100 different ideas you'll never actually use. You don't need to read every book in a field. You need to deeply understand a handful of principles that actually move the needle and apply them relentlessly, rather than collecting more half-absorbed knowledge that sits unused, the intellectual equivalent of a gym membership nobody visits. There's a particular kind of confidence required for all of this, and it's worth naming honestly, because it's the part that makes strategic laziness genuinely uncomfortable rather than simply convenient. Saying no when everyone around you is saying yes. Sitting still while everyone else looks busy. Doing visibly less, at least from the outside, while everyone else performs visible effort. This requires trusting the math before the results have arrived to vindicate it. Trusting that elimination produces more, eventually, even while it currently just looks like absence. So here's a starting point that costs nothing and asks very little. just for a week. Don't add anything new to your life. Instead, eliminate one thing each day. One task, one obligation, one recurring habit that survives purely on inertia, one open mental loop that's been quietly running unresolved for longer than it should have. By the end of that week, something becomes obvious that wasn't visible before. You were never actually short on time. You were just carrying far too much of the wrong things, and nobody had ever stopped to ask whether any of it still belonged. Chapter 11. The Silence Where Ideas Are Born. Try this honestly, just for a moment. When was the last time you sat somewhere with absolutely nothing to do and didn't reach for your phone within the first 30 seconds? Not waiting for something, not between tasks, just sitting with genuine empty space in front of you and letting it stay empty. For most people, the honest answer is some version of "I genuinely can't remember," which says something quietly alarming about how thoroughly boredom has been engineered out of modern life. Every gap gets filled now. Every silence gets interrupted before it has time to settle into anything. Every idle moment gets consumed by something. A feed, a video, a notification, almost before the boredom has registered as boredom at all. And in eliminating that discomfort so thoroughly, something else got eliminated along with it. Something most people don't notice is missing until it's pointed out. The actual space where original thought happens. Here's the part that runs against most intuition. The best ideas rarely show up while you're consuming information. They show up while you're processing it. And processing requires empty space the same way digestion requires an empty stomach. Constantly feeding the mind new input, another article, another video, another scroll, leaves no room for it to actually do anything with what it already has. It's perpetually intaking, never integrating. Notice, if you think back, where your genuinely good ideas have actually arrived. Rarely at a desk, staring directly at the problem. More often in the shower, on a walk, in that strange, half-asleep stretch right before sleep actually arrives. Staring out a window during a long, unremarkable drive. What connects all of these moments isn't effort. It's the absence of input. Low stimulation, no active task. The mind left alone to wander without anywhere specific it's supposed to go. There's a name for the brain state underneath this, sometimes called the default mode network. The pattern of activity that switches on specifically when you're not focused on an external task. The state where the mind connects information it's already absorbed, finds patterns it hadn't noticed, surfaces insight that wasn't being actively searched for. The catch is that this state simply doesn't activate under constant stimulation. It needs the gaps. It needs the boredom most people have spent years training themselves to avoid on reflex. I tested this on myself, almost by accident, during a period where I'd cut back hard on phone use during any kind of waiting or downtime, mostly for unrelated reasons. The unexpected side effect was a noticeable uptick in the kind of stray, useful ideas that used to feel rare, not during deliberate brainstorming sessions, which had always felt strained and forced, but during walks, during the boring parts of commutes, during stretches of genuinely doing nothing. The ideas weren't better because I was trying harder to have them. They showed up because for once, there was room. There's a related practice worth naming here, sometimes called productive meditation. Working through a specific problem while engaged in something physical that doesn't demand much mental focus. Walking being the classic example. The walking occupies just enough of the mind to keep it from spiraling into anxious noise, while leaving enough free capacity for the actual problem to roam, unforced, around the edges of awareness. It's a strange middle state, not idle, not actively working either, somewhere productively in between. The discomfort here is real and worth naming honestly rather than glossing over. Sitting with genuine emptiness, even for a few minutes, tends to be surprisingly uncomfortable for people who've gone years without practicing it. The mind races. A flood of things you should be doing surfaces almost immediately, demanding attention, trying to fill the silence with anything at all. This is normal, and it's not a sign you're doing it wrong. It's just an underused muscle complaining about being asked to work again. Starting small here matters more than starting ambitiously. 5 minutes, deliberately, with nothing. No phone, no book, no music, just sitting somewhere reasonably comfortable and letting the time pass unfilled. The discomfort in the first attempt is often intense enough that people abandon it within the first minute, mistaking the discomfort for proof the exercise isn't working. It's usually the opposite. The discomfort is exactly the resistance the practice is meant to wear down, and it does, gradually. The same way any unfamiliar exercise gets easier with repetition rather than staying hard forever. What eventually settles in, somewhere after the discomfort fades, isn't dramatic. It's quieter than that. A mind that's slightly less frantic by default, slightly more capable of generating its own material, instead of constantly waiting for the next piece of external input to react to. And in that settling, something genuinely useful tends to surface, unforced, the kind of idea that feels like it arrived from nowhere but never actually does. It arrives from the silence that was finally given enough room to hold it. So the invitation here is small and doesn't require restructuring an entire life around it. Stop filling every gap automatically. Let one wait this week stay genuinely empty instead of getting reflexively filled. Not because boredom is virtuous in itself, but because the next idea worth having probably isn't hiding in another article or another video. It's likely already somewhere inside you, quietly waiting for enough silence to finally surface. Chapter 12. The night before the week begins. Sunday evening has a particular texture for most people. A low hum of dread. The sense of something ending before it even properly began. Monday looming somewhere just past the horizon like weather you can feel coming. Almost nobody uses that evening for anything except quietly bracing for what's next. Which is strange, given that it's also the single highest leverage hour available all week, sitting there mostly unused. Here's the difference worth naming plainly. Most people let the week happen to them. Arrive Monday morning, open email, discover 17 things already on fire. Spend the next 5 days reacting to whatever's loudest. The alternative isn't complicated, even if it's rarely practiced. Design the week before it starts, rather than discovering its shape after the fact, one fire at a time. This doesn't require an elaborate system. 60 to 90 minutes, once a week, Sunday evening tends to work well, though the specific day matters less than the habit itself. Spent doing something most people skip entirely. Actually looking at the week ahead before it arrives, rather than meeting it cold. The process starts with looking backward, briefly, before looking forward. Not with judgment, that part matters more than it sounds like it should, but with genuine curiosity. What worked this past week? What drained energy without producing much? Where time actually went, compared to where you'd assumed it was going. This isn't an exercise in guilt. It's closer to being a scientist studying your own behavior, gathering data rather than passing verdicts, because the patterns that surface here are often more honest than anything you'd have guessed without looking. From there, the next step is simply emptying everything out. Every task, half-formed idea, lingering worry, unscheduled obligation currently floating somewhere in your head onto paper or a screen. with no attempt yet to organize any of it. This isn't the organizing step. It's just the unloading step. And it matters more than it sounds like it should, because most people are quietly carrying 30 or 40 unresolved open loops at any given time, without realizing how much background attention that's costing them. Once everything's out and visible, the real work begins. Choosing. Out of everything on that list, what are the 3 outcomes that, if achieved this week, would make the week feel genuinely successful? Not 30 things. 3. This step is harder than it sounds, specifically because it requires actual choosing. And choosing means leaving things out, including things that feel important in isolation, but don't survive the comparison against what actually matters most. These 3 become the week's non-negotiables. Everything else is secondary, however urgent it might feel in the moment. With the big 3 identified, the calendar gets built around them, not the other way around. This is where most planning systems quietly fail, because they schedule the small stuff first and hope the important work finds space in whatever's left over. It rarely does. Real protected blocks, treated with the same seriousness as an important meeting, get carved out first for the big 3. Existing commitments get layered in afterward. And somewhere in this process, it's worth asking where the week's energy peaks are likely to land, and protecting those specifically for whatever requires the sharpest thinking. Monday morning before meetings start eating into it, perhaps. Or whichever stretch tends to hold the clearest head. There's a quieter, more practical layer worth adding here. One that has less to do with scheduling and more to do with environment. For whatever you want more of this week, reduce the friction in advance. Clothes laid out, materials within reach, the first step already half prepared, so starting requires less activation energy than it otherwise would. For whatever you want less of, add friction deliberately. Distance, inconvenience, an extra step between impulse and action. Willpower gets too much credit in most productivity advice. Environment design gets too little, and it tends to outperform willpower reliably, especially on the days willpower is running low anyway. The session closes with something that sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet consistently does. A few minutes spent actually picturing the week ahead, specifically the moments of executing the big 3, anticipating where friction is likely to show up and what the response to it might look like in advance. This isn't mystical. It's closer to mental rehearsal, the same kind used in sports and surgery, where performance improves measurably just from having walked through the sequence beforehand, even without having physically practiced it yet. What changes after a few weeks of this isn't dramatic, at least not immediately. It's quieter than that. Monday morning starts arriving with a sense of direction rather than disorientation. The 17 fires either don't show up in the first place, having been deleted or deferred the night before, or they show up against a week that already has a shape, rather than ambushing one that has none. The contrast, once you've experienced both versions a few times, becomes genuinely hard to ignore. There's a particular phrase worth holding on to here, because it captures the entire trade being made. 1 hour of planning saves roughly 10 hours of chaos. It's not an exact ratio, obviously, but it's close enough to true that most people who actually try this, even once, find it hard to go back to meeting weeks unprepared. Life isn't really one continuous, undifferentiated stretch of time. It's made of weeks, stacked one after another, and a person who learns to design their weeks, rather than merely survive them is, almost by definition, designing the shape of everything those weeks eventually add up to. So if nothing else from this chapter sticks, try the version of it just once, this coming Sunday, or whichever evening fits your particular rhythm. 90 minutes, maybe less the first time through. See what Monday feels like afterward. The control was likely there the whole time. Most people simply never tried using it. Chapter 13. The hour you don't get back. There's a very specific spiral that happens after wasting time, and it's almost more damaging than the wasted time itself. You lose an hour to something mindless. Then, instead of just losing the hour, you spend the next 3 feeling guilty about it, which produces no work either, which compounds the guilt further until an entire afternoon has been quietly sacrificed to the aftermath of a single mistake that, on its own, would have cost almost nothing. This is worth naming plainly because it's one of the more common and least discussed failure patterns. The damage from wasting time rarely comes from the time itself. It comes from what happens after. The shame spiral that turns one bad hour into a bad day, and sometimes a bad week, simply because nobody interrupted the pattern early enough to stop it from spreading. Here's the part worth accepting up front, because resisting it is what causes most of the actual damage. You will waste time. Not occasionally as some unlikely failure of discipline, but reliably as a normal part of being a person with a finite amount of willpower and an inconsistent nervous system. The question was never whether this happens. It's what happens in the minutes immediately afterward, because that response determines whether one bad hour stays one bad hour or metastasizes into something much larger. The default response for most people is some version of internal shame. I'm such a failure. I knew I couldn't stick to this. Why do I always do this to myself? This response feels, in the moment, like accountability, like you're taking the wasted time seriously, treating it with appropriate severity. In practice, it does the opposite. Shame reinforces exactly the identity you're trying to move away from. Every time you tell yourself, I'm someone who can't follow through, you're casting a vote for that version of yourself, and the brain, unhelpfully, tends to keep score and act accordingly. I learned this the hard way, repeatedly, over a long stretch where a single wasted morning would routinely derail an entire week. The pattern was always the same. Lose an hour or two to something mindless, spiral into guilt about it, decide somewhere in the spiral that the day was already ruined, so there wasn't much point trying to salvage what remained. By evening, what started as a single wasted hour had quietly consumed the entire day. Not because the original hour demanded that much, but because the shame response did. There's a useful structure for handling this, something closer to a failure autopsy than a confession. Doctors perform autopsies not to assign blame, but to extract information. What actually happened? What caused it? What can be learned to prevent it next time? High performers, it turns out, treat their own lapses roughly the same way, and the framework is worth borrowing directly. The first step is acknowledgement without judgment, which sounds easy and is genuinely difficult in practice. I wasted time today, full stop, with no extension into a verdict about character. Not that happened, which proves I'm fundamentally undisciplined. Just that happened. Naming it accurately without the moral overlay is the first thing that interrupts the spiral before it builds momentum. From there, the second step is understanding the actual trigger, which is almost always more specific and more forgivable than the shame response wants to admit. Was the lapse driven by exhaustion, a depleted brain reaching for the easiest available distraction because it genuinely didn't have the capacity for anything harder? Was it avoidance? A difficult task looming that felt too large to start, so something easier absorbed the time instead? Was it isolation? Loneliness disguising itself as the need to scroll, when what was actually needed was a conversation with an actual person? There's almost always a reason, and finding the real one matters, because it's the only thing that actually prevents a repeat. Generic shame prevents nothing. Specific understanding prevents quite a lot. The third step is extracting whatever lesson the trigger actually points to. If exhaustion was the cause, the fix is rarely more discipline, it's more sleep, or a lighter schedule the next day. If avoidance was the cause, the fix is usually breaking the avoided task into something smaller and less intimidating, rather than willing yourself to confront the whole thing at once. If isolation was the cause, the fix has nothing to do with productivity systems at all, and everything to do with actually reaching out to someone. The lesson is rarely try harder. It's almost always more specific and considerably more useful than that. The fourth step, and the one that actually breaks the spiral in practice, is resetting immediately rather than waiting for some symbolic restart, like tomorrow or next Monday. That hour's gone, genuinely, permanently, but the next hour isn't. This distinction matters enormously because most people treat a single lapse as contagious, as though it's already infected the rest of the day and there's no point salvaging what remains. It hasn't. One wasted hour is exactly that. 1 hour. It only becomes a wasted day through a decision, made somewhere in the shame spiral, to stop trying for the rest of it. There's a small, almost silly comparison that stuck with me here. If you drop your phone, you pick it up. You don't keep dropping it repeatedly on principle, as though the first drop somehow obligated the rest. Yet that's precisely the pattern most people fall into with time. One slip, and suddenly the entire day gets treated as already lost, justifying further slips that wouldn't have happened otherwise. The phone analogy sounds almost too simple to matter, except it captures something true. One drop is just one drop. It doesn't have to become a pattern unless you decide, somewhere in the aftermath, that it already has. So the actual skill here isn't never wasting time. That's not realistic, and chasing it just sets up a more elaborate version of the same shame cycle. The skill is catching the spiral early, naming what happened without the moral overlay, extracting whatever specific lesson is actually there, and then, critically, starting the next hour clean, as though it's genuinely separate from the one before it. Because it is. Chapter 14. The 3-minute audit. Most people are too busy doing to ever stop and check whether the doing was actually worth anything. The days stack up, full, occupied, technically productive-looking, and somewhere in the accumulation, nobody pauses to ask the one question that would actually matter. Is any of this moving in a direction I actually want? Or am I just climbing very efficiently, with great discipline and focus, up a ladder leaning against the wrong wall entirely? This is what reflection is actually for, and it's worth separating from the vague, slightly mystical way the word usually gets used. This isn't journaling for its own sake, and it isn't some soft, optional add-on for people with extra time. It's closer to a system audit. The same instinct an engineer applies to a piece of machinery that's been running for a while. Not because something's necessarily broken, but because nothing runs forever without drift. And drift caught early is cheap, while drift caught late is expensive. There are 3 useful layers to this, each operating at a different scale, and they're worth keeping distinct rather than collapsing into one vague habit of thinking about your day sometimes. The first is daily, and it costs almost nothing. 5 minutes, typically in the evening, before the day fully closes out. 3 questions asked honestly. What did I accomplish today that actually moved something forward? Where did time or energy leak out somewhere it shouldn't have? What's one specific thing I'll do differently tomorrow? That's the entire practice. No elaborate journaling, no extensive writing required, just 5 minutes of honest accounting before the day disappears into the next one unexamined. What this small daily habit actually produces more than any specific insight, is awareness. The simple, underrated act of noticing patterns while they're still small enough to adjust easily. Most people end their day by collapsing straight into distraction, scrolling until sleep arrives, with zero examination of what just happened in the previous 12 hours. A 5-minute pause before that collapse changes very little in the moment, but compounds meaningfully over weeks. The same way checking a bank balance daily, even briefly, changes spending behavior more than checking it once a year ever could. The second layer is weekly, and it deserves more room than the daily check. Something closer to 30 minutes, ideally on a consistent day. Looking at the previous week with slightly more distance than the daily version allows. Where did time actually go, compared to where you'd intended it to go before the week started? That gap between intention and reality is consistently the most useful piece of information in the entire practice, because it's rarely random. It tends to repeat, week after week, in ways that reveal something specific and addressable, once someone's actually looking for the pattern instead of just living inside it. The questions here run a bit deeper than the daily version. What were the genuine wins this week? The things actually worth acknowledging? What consistently drained energy without much to show for it? What patterns are showing up again, the third or fourth time now, that are worth actually naming instead of quietly tolerating? What's one system, one habit, one piece of structure that could be adjusted heading into next week? None of this is about judgment. It's data collection on your own behavior, conducted with the same neutral curiosity a scientist brings to an experiment, rather than the harsh, useless self-criticism most people default to instead. The third layer, monthly, pulls back further still. 60 to 90 minutes, once a month, looking at the larger shape of things rather than any single week's details. Are the daily and weekly choices actually accumulating toward something? Or is the activity just sustaining itself without direction? Is the identity actually shifting in the intended direction? Or has the same pattern simply been repeating under new labels? This is also where wins genuinely deserve to be named and sat with for a moment, not glossed over in a rush toward the next goal. The brain responds to acknowledged progress in a way it doesn't respond to progress that's simply assumed and moved past. Shikantiya, failures and setbacks get reviewed here too, but specifically for extraction rather than punishment. What actually happened? What can be learned from it? Not as self-flagellation, but as raw material. The same way an experiment that didn't confirm the hypothesis is still useful data, not a wasted attempt. The single most important question in this monthly layer, though, isn't about output at all. It's about identity. Who am I actually becoming through all of this? Because that, ultimately, is the real measure underneath everything else. Not how much got done in a given month, but who was doing it by the end of that month, and whether that person looks anything like who you're actually trying to become. There's a common objection worth addressing directly here, because it's the reason most people skip this entirely. Doesn't all this reflecting just eat into time that could have been spent actually doing things? The honest answer runs the opposite direction. Reflection isn't time taken away from progress. It's what prevents months of effort spent quietly heading in the wrong direction before anyone notices. 30 minutes spent weekly catching a misalignment early is considerably cheaper than 3 months spent compounding that same misalignment, unexamined, before it finally becomes impossible to ignore. Think of it less like an expense and more like a navigation correction. A small, frequent adjustment costs almost nothing and keeps the larger trajectory roughly on course. Skipping the correction doesn't save time. It just delays the moment the drift becomes undeniable, at which point the correction required is considerably larger, considerably more painful, and arrives considerably later than it needed to. So the actual ask here is small, layered, and doesn't require overhauling anything about how the days themselves are spent. 5 minutes most evenings, 30 minutes most weeks, 90 minutes most months. None of it glamorous, none of it producing anything that looks, from the outside, like accomplishment. And yet, stacked together over a year, this quiet, unglamorous habit of checking the balance regularly tends to be the single clearest differentiator between a year that compounded into something and a year that simply happened, unexamined, one full but directionless day at a time. Chapter 15. Who you are when no one's counting the hours. Here's the question this entire book has been quietly building toward. The one that finally makes all the smaller tactics make sense together rather than feeling like a disconnected list of habits. Who are you actually becoming? Hour by hour, whether or not anyone's watching, including yourself. Most attempts at change start in the wrong place, and this is worth naming plainly because it explains why so many of them fail in roughly the same predictable way. They start with behavior. I need to wake up earlier. I need to stop procrastinating. I need to be more disciplined. These are reasonable-sounding goals, and they almost never stick because behavior sits on the surface, and beneath the surface, doing the actual heavy lifting, is identity. The quiet, mostly unexamined story you carry about who you are. Behavior built on top of an unchanged identity requires constant willpower to maintain because it's fighting against the current rather than moving with it. The distinction is simple once it's named, even though almost nobody names it explicitly. Behavior-based change asks, what should I do? Identity-based change asks, who am I becoming? The first requires ongoing force, a kind of internal argument repeated daily, because the new behavior conflicts with the old self-image. The second requires almost no force at all, because the behavior simply becomes an expression of who you already believe yourself to be, rather than an imposition fighting against it. Picture two people, both trying to use time better, starting from roughly the same place. The first says, I'm terrible with time management, but I'm going to really try to improve. Notice the identity embedded right there in the sentence. Terrible with time management, trying to change despite that. Every disciplined choice this person makes is, on some level, a small battle against their own self-concept, which is exhausting in a way that's hard to sustain past a few weeks. The second says, I'm someone who values time and invests it deliberately. The identity here is already different, already settled, and every choice this person makes simply confirms something already true, rather than fighting to override something assumed to be permanent. This is, more than anything else, why resolutions fail at the rate they do. The behavior gets set as a goal, but the identity underneath stays exactly where it was, still whispering the old story every time the new behavior gets attempted. Eventually, predictably, the identity wins, because identity is the more deeply rooted of the two, and the behavior snaps back to whatever the underlying self-image actually believed the whole time. The shift, fortunately, doesn't require some dramatic internal transformation arriving overnight. It happens through several smaller, more practical channels, each one reinforcing the others. Language is the first, and it's easy to underestimate precisely because it feels so small. The sentences repeated about yourself, even casually, even as throwaway jokes, function as votes. I'm always late. I'm a procrastinator. I'm bad with time. Each repetition reinforces the identity being described, regardless of whether it's said seriously or as self-deprecating humor. The brain doesn't distinguish tone particularly well. It mostly just tracks the claim being made repeatedly and adjusts behavior to stay consistent with it. The replacement isn't some forced, falsely positive affirmation. It's simply more accurate language about the direction already underway. I'm learning to value my time more. I'm becoming someone who follows through. These aren't lies told to yourself. They're descriptions of a process already in motion, said out loud enough times that the brain starts treating them as true. Evidence is the second channel, and it matters more than language alone, because identity built purely on words without proof tends to be fragile. Every small action aligned with the new identity functions as a vote, and votes accumulate. Took action within a day of a real idea. That's evidence of being a doer, not just someone who has ideas. Used a waiting room to read instead of scroll. Evidence of being a learner. Protected a prime time block instead of letting it get eaten by email. Evidence of respecting your own peak hours. None of this requires perfection. The tipping point isn't 100% consistency. It's somewhere around just over half. Enough votes accumulating in the new direction to outweigh the old pattern, which is a considerably lower bar than the all-or-nothing standard most people quietly hold themselves to before giving up entirely. Environment is the third channel, and it's the one most people neglect, mostly because it requires upfront effort rather than ongoing willpower. Surroundings either reinforce the intended identity or quietly sabotage it, with very little middle ground. A workspace that's cluttered makes focus harder regardless of how disciplined the person sitting in it intends to be. A phone kept on the nightstand makes scrolling the path of least resistance at exactly the moment a book was supposed to win instead. The fix isn't more willpower applied against a hostile environment. It's redesigning the environment so the desired choice becomes the easy one, and the undesired choice requires just enough extra friction to lose. More often than not, on the days willpower alone wouldn't have been enough. The fourth channel, community, gets dismissed too quickly by people who assume it doesn't apply to them personally. It does, reliably, through something closer to quiet contagion than conscious influence. Attitudes toward time, busyness, focus, and direction spread through the people closest to you, mostly without anyone noticing it happening. This doesn't require dramatically restructuring relationships. It does mean being a little more deliberate about whose patterns get absorbed most, and occasionally seeking out people who already embody the identity being built, if only to make that identity feel a little less unusual and a little more like the obvious, normal way to operate. What makes identity-based change compound in a way behavior-based change rarely does is the absence of ongoing internal friction. Once the identity has genuinely shifted, the choices stop requiring debate. There's no longer a decision about whether to scroll or read during a wait. The identity already settled that question. There's no longer a negotiation about protecting prime time. It's simply what someone who respects their own peak hours does, without needing to relitigate the point daily. This is what makes behavior finally feel effortless. Not more discipline applied to the same resistant self. A genuinely different self, where the old resistance simply isn't there to overcome anymore. And underneath everything covered across this entire book, the prime time, the 24-hour rule, the zero wait time, the energy management, the batching, the elimination, the boredom, the weekly design, the failure autopsies, the regular audits, sits this same final layer, the one that actually makes all the others sustainable rather than another short-lived system abandoned within a month. The small daily improvements aren't really about the tasks themselves. They're votes, repeated often enough, for a specific kind of person. Someone who notices the account balance instead of spending blindly. Someone who treats the 2 or 3 sharpest hours as something worth protecting. Someone who starts within a day rather than letting an idea quietly expire. None of this happens through force. It happens through identity, built one small, mostly invisible choice at a time. until eventually it's no longer a system being followed. It's simply who you've become. Conclusion. There's no dramatic ending to a book like this, and that's intentional, because the actual transformation it's pointing toward was never going to arrive as a single dramatic moment in the first place. It arrives, if it arrives at all, through 100 small, mostly unremarkable choices, repeated long enough that they stop feeling like choices and start feeling like identity. You still have the same 86,400 seconds today that you had on the first page. So does everyone else, regardless of background, talent, or circumstance. The playing field really is that level, which is either the most comforting or most uncomfortable fact in this entire book, depending on how honestly you're willing to look at where your own seconds have actually been going. The difference was never going to be more time. There isn't any more available for anyone, ever. The difference is what gets noticed, what gets protected, what gets started within a day instead of left to quietly expire, what gets eliminated instead of carried forward out of habit. None of it requires talent. None of it requires luck. It requires attention, repeated daily, to an account most people have simply never thought to check. The clock started the moment you woke up this morning. It won't stop until you close your eyes tonight. What happens between those 2 points was never really a mystery. It was always just a question of where the seconds went and whether anyone was paying attention while they did.